friendships, colonization, betrayal, world war. This is the story of two national coalitions fighting over the fate of the northern continent in Minecraft's oldest civilization server. Join Stoneworks today, become a king, businessman, or cult leader, and your story can end up in these videos at the IP play.stoneworks.gg. The Red Spire, a communist rocket tower from an old and frozen Minecraft world, crash-landed on the tundra wastes of the northern continent. There emerged the players of Vizdom, Anonymous 001, Zemhazed, and Clone 3A7. They explored the snowy plains and created a fortified base for exploring and settling the empty region to consolidate into the socialist nation of Vladistan. As they were exploring, they met another group of players to the south, brought here from the old worlds by their nation's goddess, under a covenant that would protect them and bless their monarchs. They called their growing nation Vagaria, and were led by the players Luxoria, LT7, and Is It Pancake? It is. The two nations settled their regions with grandiose cities and explored out to meet more neighbors, like Tyahil, a Russian nation gathered around a mighty metropolis, and the Golden Empire of many mixed races and ideologies united under one monarchy, and the nation of Nordicium, which immediately got into skirmishes with Vladistan over where exactly to draw their border. As these northern nations were getting their foothold, drama stirred in the world of Abexilis. The faraway nation of Bpec was asserting itself as the hegemon of the central continent, where nations grouped together into coalitions and beat the out of Bpec in the Sting War, leaving it weakened and diplomatically isolated. And the nations of Carinthia and Jerize shared a religious revolution that would bring them closer and closer together. Meanwhile, many nations on the northern continent were arguing and bickering over the continent's name, Tiberia or Norvinia. Battle lines were drawn in the sand, and the Vladistan leader Vizdom created the Tiberian League, whereas Nordicium, Carinthia, and Jerize fought for the name Norvinia. Guys, seriously, both of these names suck, but Vizdom's Tiberia won out. Welcome to Tiberia! As all this was going on, a military leader from Jerize was sending threats from across the sea to the little nation of Jonkberg, announcing that Jonkberg was claiming and encroaching upon their ally Carinthia's territory. Jerize was gearing up for war across the sea, threatening the Tiberian leaders with an outside invasion of their soil. But the Carinthian leaders Imvi and Solonius told everyone to calm down for a minute. They had good relations with their neighbors in Tiberia, so they sat down to de-escalate with a peace deal. By the end of it, Carinthia formed a non-aggression pact with their Tiberian neighbors, and war was averted. Simultaneously, the little Tiberian nation of Murim collapsed from civil war, so the leaders of Bpec sent the newly formed Bpec Trading Company over to clean up the pieces into a colony here, hopeful to churn a profit from new industries and lands, and recuperate some international prestige they had lost from the recent Sting War. At the same time, the nation Nordicium, anxious about hostilities with the Tiberian League, fell under the sway of the mighty military empire of Kori from the central continent, giving them an allied foothold in the northern lands. And most notably, Carinthia and Jerize officially united around their religion into the Holy Empire of Sauria, a mighty empire now stretched across the seas, bolstered by vassals around the region, and led by the Shah of Loki and players experienced in the vicious brutality of war. Look at this from the Tiberians' perspective for a second. They had just averted a crisis where Jerize would have invaded a small ally's land, and that overseas power now formed a union, putting them half on their continent. The military power Kori had brought their contentious neighbor under their influence, and their ally Bpec was absorbing their small neighbors into explicit colonies. According to Tiberia, this triumvirate of powerful overseas nations was trying to colonize their homeland. The Tiberian League and Coalition began throwing threats at each other, so the people called for a summit for everyone to work things out. Leaders from across the continents met together in the Tyahil capital, Potapiv Yenderet. Potapiv Yandradel. Vizdom, Warbrand, Luxoria, LT7, Weoslavian, and Paul Panzer 007 pulled up as the backbone of the Tiberian League. The Saurian leader Armino Sambrino got up to defend their actions. How could Sauria be colonizing Tiberia if half of our empire was born and bred on Tiberian soil? If it was about the old leader of Jerizay threatening Jonkberg, that was a rogue general not cooperating with the government. And Jonkberg was squatting on our land! Sauria has a right to defend its borders. Nordesium has a right to ally with Kori. And BPEC has a right to take some unstable small nations under their little B-wing.
Shut up, colonizer!
We are not colonizers! We are protectors! Clearly, many Tiberians did not agree. It just so happened that the Saurian Alliance previously wanted to name the continent Norvinia, so they voted to officially make this name an offensive slur. Everyone left this meeting bitter and grumbling about the other side, and quite frankly, it seems to have just made things worse. Soon after, the Golden Empire staked a claim right outside of Sauria's capital of Ahurain, and Sauria directly threatened them with war. It was clear now that the Tiberian League should not be some loose alliance for everyone to cooperate and talk, but a pact that would need to stand against what they saw as a colonizing coalition. The leaders got together and consolidated a revolutionary ideology that would help fuse their continent together against this existential threat: Pan-Tiberianism. The tenets at this point were simple: stand together against colonialism, build infrastructure to link the continent together, and protect the various cultures, ideologies, and nations of Tiberia from external influence and oppression. In a bit of support for this unifying movement, the leaders Vizdum, Luxoria, Weoslavian, and Warbrand took the title Tiberian as a part of their personal roleplay names. The leaders went to the expert cartographers of Abexilus and petitioned them to show this block of nations together, formed newly as the Tiberium. The Tiahilian scholar Weoslavian wrote of this movement, "This alliance will be the centerpiece of an anti-colonialist front, formed by various Tiberian nations, defending the continent and throwing the imperialists into the seas, and put an end to the instability brought by violence and map painting." Vizdum met together with the other leaders and planned a detailed attack on the BPEC trading company's holdings. Other leaders weren't too sure, preferring instead to go after the adjutant puppet enemy of Nordesium. But that night, an assassin broke into Vizdum's home and shot him in the knee 6 times, fleeing into the night, leaving him dead on the ground. The energized leader of the Tiberium was dead. Luxoria wailed in grief, so she and the leader Facho mounted fire-breathing phantoms, flying across the sea to the Saurian vassal of Nova Stellare. There they laid waste to a town, torching buildings and burning its citizens to a crisp. The smoldering wreckage of this attack signaled to all the violent start of the war. After the Tiberium held an assembly to officially declare war, there was a scramble on both sides for allies and war materials, and a reshuffling of national relationships. Paul Panzer 007 and Warbrand facilitated the rebellion of the Saurian vassals Volnitz and Levin. The player Konishi cooed back his major Saurian vassal Maesenia, liberating it over to the Tiberium. Aesinodi joined with Sauria. Arria entered into the Tiberium, and Amiris, Draconis, and Venovia pledged support for the Tiberium. Venovia's siding made the big empire of Ishanor hesitant to fulfill their military defense pact with Sauria, so they wanted to sit this one out. But then a Saurian leader called them pedophiles, and so they supported the Tiberium instead. Good work. Loranic pledged 300 sets of diamond armor to their Tiberium overlords, but they also wanted like half of Sauria's land and were going, gimme, no, we want land, gimme land, gimme land. And it was annoying. They never gave the 300 sets of armor, by the way. There's detailed stories on all this drama and chaos, but let's move on. The Tiberium meticulously planned out their war, with Excel spreadsheets of all the gear they'd need, who was sending what, and their attack strategies. Fagaria ended up leading the charge of the war. Arria financed them, the Golden Empire and Sondaria did their diplomacy, and Tiahil churned out war gear like a factory. Meanwhile, the Saurian leaders Three Sweat and Clear Lion pushed their Shah to start grinding for the war and organizing. But the Shah said it's fine, they already have enough materials. Now, the Tiberium finally decided to launch their first campaign into Nordesium. So they sent an army to encamp at the village of Maringrad, right across the ice lake from Nordesium's town of Phaetons. Take this old, overextended outpost, and Nordesium's mayors would lose faith, and this vulnerable home front would be secure. The enemy coalition mirrored Tiberium's encampment, and they spent all night digging in, preparing deep, defensive gank trenches around their towns. Over 300 players stared each other down from across the frozen lake as their generals laid out their battle plans. The Tiberium leaders estimated they had a great numerical superiority, so they decided to lead an explosive charge into Thetans while the enemy was preparing their defenses and disorganized, using the hired Aragothan mercenaries leading the front. The generals lined up the Tiberian troops along the frozen shore and gave the signal. Go! The army sprinted across the ice. When they got to the edge of the ganks, they broke the ice for water to flow down into it, and the soldiers safely jumped down into the deep trenches. The enemy soldiers sounded the alarm and poured arrows into the attackers, but most were cut down before they could form units. Tiberium forces started spreading out around the ganks when an enemy counterattack wheeled in against them. The forces clashed together in the trenches. Their progress slowed and they fought tooth and nail for single blocks. The enemy counterattack was repelled, but they began sending hit-and-run troops with TNT to destroy the Tiberium's attempts to capture chunks of land. They clashed on and on for hours until the day came to an end and the armies were exhausted. The Tiberium had committed profound losses upon the enemy coalition and destroyed much of their defenses, but they had not yet fully taken Thetans. That night, the Saurians had snuck a message to the Aragothan mercenaries and offered a larger payment for their support in the battle, so Aragotha left the camp and installed themselves on the coalition's front lines. At the drop of a message, Tiberium had lost its army's superiority, but they decided to march again over the ice anyways. The soldiers jumped down into the Thetans' ganks again, but were met with the coalition's prepared resistance. Many were shot down coming into the ganks, falling and dying on the stone below, and Aragotha rained TNT from above. The mercenaries fractured the Tiberium army and cut down each little section of it. When Tiberium faltered here in its attack, the enemies charged to counterattack across the ice, fighting on the frozen lake and streets of Maringrad, tunneling into holes from which they could capture the town's chunks for themselves. The Tiberium forces dug down and jumped on the coalition forces. After brutal and tenacious underground fighting, the coalition was kicked out back onto the ice, and the battered Tiberium army stared them down once again. The stalemate of Thetans and Maringrad so far caused many to waver in their support for Tiberium, as the nation of Seleaquil suffered a rebellion, and many contacted Sauria to open negotiations if they should win. But the Tiberium leaders messaged Aragotha, and they outbid Sauria's outbidding. So Aragotha returned to the Tiberium's camp. Both armies were now at half strength, both towns had been brutalized, and both troops stood out on the ice and taunted each other, yelling insults and nasty threats. But the Tiberium army received news from the wider world. First, that the Saurian Shah Vlogi stepped down to manage the war, being replaced by the leader Clearlion. But more pressingly, BPEC's community had become hopeless to win the war, so their government collapsed. The BPEC trading company area was given back to Murim, and Loranic finally got some of their desired land. But these two Tiberium states immediately started jumping at each other's throats, and now states in the Tiberium were starting to take sides over that issue, risking the integrity of the United Front. With the Tiberium getting antsy, if they wanted to hold everything together, they would need a win right now. So the Tiberium launched out a third time over the ice, intent on pushing to the center of Thetans. The enemy coalition met them out on the ice, and they fought a ruthless, pitched battle, slipping and sliding all around. The Tiberians were held at bay by the ganks, unable to cross the gaping chasm as enemy archers fired upon them. But just then, the player Facho emerged from the back, flying on a fire-breathing phantom, and he scorched the coalition soldiers and made an opening for the Tiberium. They quickly bridged across the ganks and poured into the center of Thetans, sweeping up the rest of the enemy soldiers and finally conquering it for good. The other claims in Nordesium refused to fight the victorious Tiberians, and the northern campaign was won. The Tiberium forces then regrouped to march south to one of the Saurian capitals, Ahurain. The Saurian leadership was thrown into a panic. Just as the Shura's Three Sweat and Clearlion had predicted, they were not prepared for this fight to go on. But as the Tiberium forces camped in the foothills of southern Vagaria, they were met by a player named Sinister Asp, the military leader from the prosperous global empire of Solj. He brought the Saurian leaders to negotiate, and the Tiberium sent them their demands for peace. 3 towns, half the capital of Ahurain, delete the squatter claims around to their nations, and some cold hard cash. But as these negotiations were going on, The Saurian leaders signed themselves up as a vassal to the mighty Empire of Solj. Sinister Asp told the Tiberium to stand down from its invasions and demands, lest the mighty Empire of Solj enter the fray and use its vast mercenary armies to trample them. Faced with no other choice, the Tiberium leaders stood down. This is how the war came to an end. The Tiberium did not get the concessions they had wanted out of a formal peace treaty, and they remained bitter and resentful at Solj's Deus Ex Machina saving Savria. Despite this, they had successfully stopped the expansion of outside powers over Tiberia. For when Savria joined Solj, many of its Tiberian vassals revolted and seceded. Bipek and its colonies were fully dismantled, and Nordesium was weakened and isolated among all its neighbors. The Tiberium soon dissolved because it was no longer needed, but Tiberia would stay in Tiberian hands. But Savria's lore master, Oshichi, saw the bitter resentment lingering beyond the fighting, and he knew, in a matter of months, they would descend to war once again, not just Tiberia, but the world. Thanks for watching. If you want to join any of these nations, fight in wars, or end up in a video like this, join the IP play.stoneworks.gg.